Hey, so I'm going to do this mostly because I'm doing video tests today, so this is not normally something I would do for a video, but I'm working on like the lighting and trying to figure out how this is going to work for doing a new studio. So Dave247 asked, for example, are we still separating application roles out on different servers? For example, if I have an application with a web front end and a SQL database backend, in the past it used to be best practice to separate those two roles and have one server for the web server and another server for the SQL database server. Is this still common practice? So I want to kind of address this because this is one that comes up pretty often and it's worth digging into. So is it common to separate them? Yes. Is it common not to separate them? Yes. Both are common cases and neither is a best practice. I'm not sure if anybody actually said best. No, best practice was mentioned. It is not a best practice one way or the other. Like many things in IT, the best practice is to evaluate your specific needs. There are great reasons to separate, and Jared mentions them, right? It gives you more recoverability. It's more flexible. It's not generally very much more complex, so why not do it? But on the flip side, there's a lot of times that people don't do that. Specifically, web servers and web applications is a place where we generally don't do it. Now, in a really large environment where you already have a bank of database servers and you're just adding this to the workload, that is different typically. But in SMB especially, we often run our web servers, and this could be a custom line of business application. It could be your wiki, could be your company website, it could be an internal, whatever application. Very often we find those things merged together. And if you're looking at some types of software, SQL databases is not really a thing. Relational databases come in two types, right? They come as pure databases and as relational database management systems. The former being things like Berkeley DB or SQLite. The latter being things like MariaDB, Postgres, SQL Server, Oracle, and so forth. The former cannot be separated. You can't have them on another server. So any application that you're going to run with or requires something like SQLite, you don't have a choice. They have to be on the same system. It's just the way it works. There's no network layer between them. For those who have the other, then you have the flexibility, and you can do it either way. But when you put it onto a separate server, one, you have to have multiple copies of the operating system running. Of course, if you're using containers, you can change that. But once you start containerizing, it starts getting into the gray area of maybe you didn't really put it on another server. But you have the extra communications layer of going through that database. Of going through that network layer. And in doing so, you introduce latency and a point where things can break. I went through this recently. Now, there's a lot more to it than simply being local or not local, but I worked with a company that needed to have a database for their big front-end web application. They needed it to be completely reliable, and on Amazon, they were not able to get the database. Now, this is because it was hosted by a third party, but the database was hosted by the database vendor themselves. They weren't able to get the reliability that they needed because the network layer kept dropping between the VMs. Plus, there was latency. That was not a big deal, but there was extra latency. Quite a bit extra latency, right? Jumping between separate hosts, having that network communications, needing to go through firewall layers, blah, blah, blah. That adds latency and overhead when they were able to then just move to having the database be local, and suddenly they got better performance and better reliability and went from going down every few days, every 10 days, to none, right? Rock solid. Like I said, that's a complex scenario. There's lots of, it shouldn't be that complicated, but you introduce points of failure by doing so, and it has to be weighed, right? For many workloads we're dealing with in this type, we're dealing with something very simple. Oh, I need a WordPress site. Are you really going to spin up 2 VMs for a WordPress site? In many cases, we don't even think about that stuff. We think about it when we're talking about an ERP or when we're talking about some really large application that seems like we have to put a bunch of effort into it. But when we're talking about simple things like I'm going to spin up a wiki or I'm going to spin up a WordPress site, we often don't. And we would say, well, of course we would put the database and the workload in the same place. Why would we separate those, right? And there's good reasons to separate them, and there's good reasons to keep them together. Another thing to consider is that we often look at it in the aspect of the web front end might be, say, an Apache server, and the back end might be, let's say, MariaDB. That's a very common scenario, right? And maybe the one we're discussing here, for all we know. In that scenario, we often say, it's easy in this discussion to say, well, the application should be on one and the database should be on the other, right? That's a logical place to break it, and you have two VMs. But what if you were going to be running a WordPress site and a Bookstack site, right? Well, in that case, do you want to have each application on its own VM? Do you want each database to be on its own VM? Probably not. Well, what if you did one VM for both databases and one VM for both applications? Okay, that's reasonable, but you still merge some things, right? But you could break it up another way. You could say, well, what if I have my database and my Bookstack on one VM and my WordPress and its database on another? Well, you separated the same number of things, but you separated it in another way. And really kind of in many ways a more logical way. If something's going to fail, you don't want both sites going down at the same time. If you do it the more obvious way of putting the application on one database on the other, then if something were to fail, they would fail together in both cases. If the application side fails, both go down. If the database goes down, they both go down. If you have a configuration issue, say they require different databases or they require different versions, or something that we've seen quite a bit with things like NodeBB running on MongoDB, you may want to upgrade a database and find that it doesn't upgrade cleanly, and you may lose a whole bunch of workloads because MongoDB hoses itself during a normal upgrade, right? If you had discrete workloads, that would isolate and not be as difficult to deal with. And so it's not as cut and dry as it seems, and it's certainly not something around best practice. It is something that you need to evaluate how splitting is going to benefit you, how it's going to protect you, how splitting vertically or horizontally will affect you, which is better for you. Generally, you want to keep the applications apart from each other, but if you're going to have them together with something, it's their database you would want them together with. The time that you almost always want to have them separate is when you're scaling. And that's why it becomes a big deal often to have your databases separated, is because you may want to have a database layer that's maybe two servers in a cluster, two really big CPU heavy servers in a cluster, and then a whole bunch of CPU light but thread heavy servers in an application pool that may be a completely different size than the database one, and the applications spread across the pool and talk to the database, and you can add more of any different type of node as that particular workload becomes exhausted. That's a time where we always see that. So when we're talking about very large applications, the Googles, the Facebooks, the Change.orgs of the world, they have to have those things separated. They would never have them together. But when we're talking about normal SMBs dealing with websites that are only doing a few million hits a month, then having them separate may not make any sense. It may introduce costs and overhead. And especially as we start looking towards cloud workloads, the cost of having your database separate from your application layer may be not dramatically expensive, but noticeably expensive. You may be looking at a 20 to 100% increase in the cost of your VMs simply to have them separated, while also introducing performance and risk problems. Very minor ones probably, but still introducing them overall. Right, you're mitigating some, there's less crosstalk between the application and the database, but those are things that very rarely create problems. But having a network layer between them also rarely creates a problem, but is more likely to than having the two on the same server. So it's a complex question. Both approaches work. It really depends what you're doing. I would want to analyze exactly what your application is, exactly how many applications and what types are going to be on the machines, what database you're talking about, how it's going to interact, how they work with each other, and what your expected changes are over time, and bring that all together and say what are the different pieces that make the most sense in your environment to have together or separated.